It's a brand new day.
Good morning, friends. That should get you just moving, you know? I'm not really a dancer, but if I was, I would have, but sorry about that. Welcome this morning. Welcome, balcony people up there. Good to see you this morning. Welcome, online people. Yeah, I hear you. November has been a special month in our family. My second oldest son, Levi, was married last weekend, so really beautiful to bring. Yeah, that's applause worthy. So they've made it to the 7-day mark in their new journey together. And my wife and I celebrated our anniversary, our 27th anniversary on November 1st, so that was exciting. So after the service, you can express your congratulations to me and your condolences to her, because that's usually the way it works. But no, really, really grateful to be with you this morning. I think I say it all the time when I preach, and I mean it, that I often say, hey, this is one of my favorite texts that we get to be into. And I mean it because by the time I've studied it and I'm ready to teach it, it is one of my favorite texts. But this morning, I mean it, you guys, I mean it. This is one of my favorite, absolute favorite moments with Jesus, and I'm honored to teach it this morning. As we start wandering toward John 13, I want to start off with this. All of us live in a system in spaces that have structures, and they have rules, and they have systems that we understand and that we follow all the time. Your house, I know that some of your households have a lot of rules, and some of your households have not a lot of rules, but they all have rules. There are structures that you have built into what you eat and what you don't eat, or when you eat and when you don't eat, or when you go to bed or when you don't go to bed, all of those things. You go to work, and there are structures and systems in your workplace, and if they're good structures and systems, they're given with the intent of making you a healthier human. Good structures have purpose, and actually we thrive in structures that are good and wise and kind, and we just live in this space all the time. Like, you accept these structures all around you all the time without question, and you get nervous or even afraid when you're in spaces where you don't know the rules. You know, so as a kid, you know the rules of your house, but you don't know the rules of your friend's house. So you go to spend the night at your friend's house, and you're like, can I eat? I don't know. Am I going to get in trouble if I open their refrigerator? Are they going to even give me a blanket when I go to bed? I don't know. I don't know the way that their house is it's an alien world that you've just entered into. I think of the post office. It's like you walk into the post office, and they've got all of these structures, you know, and you have to learn them, what priority mail and express mail and media mail and first class and return receipts. Like, I know some of you don't use the post office at all because you don't understand how all of that stuff works, and you're like, you know what, I don't want to be shamed over the kind of box I brought in and have them tell me, oh, you can send that and it'll be $4 if you want it there Tuesday, or $800 if you want it there Monday. And you're like, I don't even understand. I'll just drive it. I'll just drive it to the person in Phoenix myself because I don't want to deal with it. I don't understand the rules. These exist in our world, and you know them. So let me prove it to you. What goes up? See, that's a rule that you knew this morning when you woke up. Gravity is going to be a thing. You haven't questioned it. You just understand it. We live within that rule that exists in the world of physics. I know it's been a long time since you've taken physics, but every action has an equal and opposite. See, you still know Newton's third law. That's a world that you live in. You understand how those work. But it's not just the physical world. There's the social world. The social rules that we all understand and follow together. You know those too. Let me prove it to you. What goes around? Oh, you see? You know how the world works. Actions have consequences, and eventually those consequences bite you. So if you go and hit somebody, they're going to hit you back. That's just sort of the world rule that we understand. It's the way that our world works. How about this one? The early bird. Yeah, you work hard, you wake up early, and you'll achieve what you want to achieve. Even if you don't know it, you know it because we have these sayings that reinforce it. One more, I'll just give you one more. People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Only some of you knew that one. That's concerning to me. No, if you're going to criticize others, you have to be able to take criticism in return. Part of growing up for all of us is understanding these rules, these structures that sit in our, like, it's not just cultural. A lot of those are just sort of humans, the way that we operate socially with one another. I need you to understand before we get to John 13 this morning that in Jesus' time on this earth, in his ministry, he spent a lot of time making it clear that the rules in his kingdom aren't the same as the rules in our kingdom. As a matter of fact, sometimes those rules are in complete contradiction with each other. Matthew, if you read the Gospel of Matthew, so there are 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all tell the story of Jesus' life and ministry, and each of them tell it a different way. They focus on different things. One of Matthew's focuses is this concept, the idea that the kingdom of heaven runs by a completely different set of rules than the kingdom here, this kingdom that we are familiar with. And Jesus wanted to help us understand that. So when Jesus was teaching, he would say things like, hey, you've heard it was said this, but I actually am going to tell you this. Let me give you some examples from Matthew. In our world, first is first. Right? You climb the ladder to success. And by the ladder, I mean over other people. If it means stepping on people along the way, so be it. When you finish first, you finish first. When you finish last, you finish last. So it means something when Jesus says in Matthew 20 that in his kingdom, the first will be last and the last will be first. You should, in your head, be like, that doesn't make sense. That is not the way that first is not last here, last is not first there. In our world, we pay close attention to a person's level of influence. You can say that you don't, but you do. Whether or not they have power, whether or not they have influence, whether or not they have money. And we like to hang out with people who have, and attach ourselves to people who have more influence, who are more popular. Jesus didn't work that way. Jesus hung out with children and lepers and prostitutes and non-influencers. He didn't need you to be an influencer to pay attention to you, to talk to you. The kingdom of heaven just works differently. As a matter of fact, Jesus said in Matthew 25 that when we love the least of these, the least influential people, the most vulnerable people, it's like showing love to him. That's totally countercultural. In our world, we hear messages constantly of celebrating ourselves, believing in ourselves, elevating ourselves. But Jesus would go on to say in Matthew 16 that anyone who wants to find their life is actually going to have to lose it. In other words, you have to die to yourself if you want to find yourself. Interesting. But I'm going to argue this morning that the great granddaddy of all law-breaking ideas that Jesus gave us was this one that he gave. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus tells us in Matthew 23. Now, in the Gospel of John, again, I told you that each of these gospel authors tells a slightly different story. They are parallel to each other, but some of them choose to give extra detail in certain areas and others don't. And John, like all of the gospel authors talk about Jesus' last few moments here on earth with his disciples. He has a meal with them in the upper room, the Passover meal. All 4 authors talk about that. John is the only one who doesn't really seem to care about the meal. I mean, we just celebrated communion, which is what Jesus instituted in that meal. John doesn't want to talk about it at all. Doesn't seem like he cares about it. He races past that to get to the moment we're going to look at today. So if you would, I'm going to ask you to stand. We're going to read John 13 together. Here we go. Verse 1, it was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own, pay attention to this verse in particular. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress. This is, again, John's going to mention the meal, and we just go right past it. The devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." I love Peter. And Jesus answered, "Those who've had a bath need only wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him. Pay attention to that, too. Jesus has the knowledge in this moment of Judas's betrayal. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. And now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent them. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." You can have a seat. All right, I want to recognize a group of people here this morning who they're often not recognized, but I think that they should be. They have a very difficult and underpaid job that keeps the rest of us safe. Every day, they leave the house in the morning not knowing if they will come back home. And I think you know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about driver's ed instructors. Any of you here professionally done driver's ed? A couple of you here, gray hair, the ones that are raising their hands, probably high blood pressure medication as well, I would assume. In the driver's ed classroom, there are very intentionally two parts. One is the classroom, where they teach you the concepts and you understand what you're supposed to be doing with the concepts. And then what's the other part? It's the behind the wheel. And I would argue the second is arguably even more important than the first. I mean, you do need to understand the concepts, but it's that experiential learning that becomes the thing. Can I just draw attention to how good of a teacher that Jesus is? Because the best kinds of learning really are classroom and experience together. We need both of those. It's not just theological learning. When he only has a few moments left, this is his last night. This is his last teaching opportunity that he has. I mean, Jesus cheats a little bit and comes back from the dead and has more teaching opportunities, okay? But pre-death, this is the last opportunity that he has to teach the disciples. And what does he do? He leans into this experiential moment with them that had to be, I mean, I know we read it fast. This had to be so long and awkward. Even if it's just 3 to 5 minutes per disciple, this is a 30 to 45-minute exercise. So they finish dinner. There's all this discussion and conversation, I'm sure. And then Jesus awkwardly gets up, takes on the posture of a servant by taking off much of his clothing, comes back with a basin, and gets down, and then starts washing one disciple's feet. I mean, they had to be stunned, looking at each other to be like, what are we doing? Are you gonna do this? Are you gonna let him do this? He gets to Peter's feet. We know from later in this passage, this is the passage where he says, "Peter, you're gonna deny me." He knows it's gonna happen. Carefully sits and washes the feet of Peter, who that night will deny even knowing him. Keeps moving down the line, slowly, washes the feet of Judas, who we're told in this passage he knows that night is going to betray him, hand him off to be arrested. This is the lesson. This is the experiential lesson that Jesus decided to hold for the last. how important this lesson is for Jesus and how this redefines several laws that we hold sacred and that we think are important. I want to offer, I could give you 30, but I'm going to choose 3 this morning, things that Jesus completely redefines in this act. And the first one is an act of Jesus redefining love, of him redefining the way that we think about and understand what love is. Verse 1 says that he loved them, and he now loved them to the end. The old NIV said that he showed them the full extent of his love. The Amplified translation says he loved them to the last and the highest degree. I mean, there's something important happening here where Jesus is like, I'm going to show you the fullest extent of what love is and how I show love to you. So let me do a little bit of a language lesson for you, okay? Because I think it's important for us in the way that we understand love to understand what's happening here. Because in our culture, we use the word love for everything. It's just a blanket word that we use. I love my wife, but I also love ice cream and chocolate. I love the weather in San Diego more than I love it here in Illinois. It's like, I love all of these things. And we use that same word, just like, it's not a filler word, it has meaning, but how could it possibly mean the same thing for all of those things? It doesn't. We just only have one word for love. The Greeks had many. They had different words for different kinds of love. And I'm gonna give you 3 of those. There were actually 4 or 5 that are used in classical Greek. All right, but the first one I'll give you this morning is eros. Eros in the Greek would just be a passionate love, passionate, sensual love. We get the English word erotic out of that Greek root eros. All right, so that's if the Greeks were talking about that type of love, they wouldn't just use the word love generically, they would use specifically that word. There's a second Greek word that we actually see a lot in Scripture, phileo. And phileo is a beautiful love. It's an affectionate love. It is a brotherly and a sisterly kind of love. Last weekend at our family wedding, I'm sitting at the reception and I'm talking with different people. And I had this moment where I'm in the back of the room and I'm seeing there's people on the dance floor and there's people over here talking. And I'm seeing all these different groups. There's some of the students from our ministry who are friends with my son, and there's alumni from our ministry who are there who've been a part of our family for years, and there are, our small group is there, and extended family, my family is there, and her family, who we're just getting to know, and we're merging 2 families together, they are there, and their extended families who've flown into town to be there. And it's just this moment of deep affection and love. I teared up looking at how all of the history that was represented in that room, and how many generous people, truly, who've just given their time and attention and love to our family and to our kids, and I'm seeing them all laid out there, and it was emotional. And that's phileo love. It's beautiful. Like just something in me that just grabbed my heart in that moment and was like, man, thank you, Jesus, for how you have blessed us tonight. This is so touching and beautiful to me as a dad. That's phileo love. It's meaningful. It comes from, we would call it our heart. It comes from our heart. Our emotions center. That's what it is. In the moment where Jesus goes to, Lazarus has died in John 11, and Jesus goes to raise him from the dead, but it hasn't happened yet, and everybody's mad and angry and sad all at the same time, and they're all talking and crying, and that's the moment in John where it says that Jesus wept. And then right after that verse, people say, oh, look at how Jesus loved him. And that's the word phileo. They're seeing Jesus crying, and they're like, oh, he was deeply moved in his spirit. He had affection. So that's what phileo is. I just need you to understand, phileo ain't the word here in John 13. Very specifically is not the word. The word that's used here in our text today is a word called agape love. And agape love isn't phileo love at all. Agape love is a love that you choose. If phileo love comes from our heart and our emotion center and our affection, agape comes from your gut and your spine. It is choosing to love something kind of regardless of whether you feel phileo love for it or not. And interestingly, in Scripture, when we look at agape love, if I go to John 3:16, that God so loved the world that he gave his son, it's agape That's the word that's used there. God so agape loved. He chose to love us. It wasn't because we were so lovable that he was just overwhelmed with affection, and in that romanticized idea, he was like, I'll give my son. I love those guys. That's not what happened. He didn't get carried away. In that moment, he chose to invest in us, to care for us, to love us. In Matthew 22, when it tells us to love the Lord our God with all our heart, it tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves. The command that we are given to love God is not phileo, it's agape. God loves you with agape love. It doesn't change. We need to love him back with agape love. It's something we choose, whether our affections choose it or not. By the way, in Luke 6, when Jesus tells me to love my enemies, agape, which makes perfect sense. How could you possibly phileo love your enemies? Oh, I love those guys trying to kill me. And if you don't understand that, it's a little confusing to read that, to be like, how in the world do I love my enemies? How do I feel affection toward my enemies? That's not the command. The command is to choose love, to choose a loving path regardless of whether they deserve it or not. By the way, in Ephesians 5, when Paul tells husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church, it's not phileo, husbands and wives, that is the engine of your love for each other. It's agape. It is a love that you choose. Phileo sometimes comes alongside. It's certainly best when it does. But the engine of your marriage is not eros. The engine of your marriage is not phileo. The engine of your marriage, of your family, of your friendships is agape love. Jesus will say in this same teachable moment in John 15, greater agape has no one than this, to lay one's life down. To lay down one's life for one's friends is the greatest form of agape, which he will show them shortly after. If we go and skip ahead a little bit in the story of the church, you'll find the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians in your Bible. Corinth, friends, was a church plant that Paul started. So he starts this church in Corinth, and then he leaves. And Corinth was a crazy town, absolutely crazy. It was Las Vegas times 10,000, and I'm not exaggerating. Absolutely off the rails in terms of sensuality, in terms of money, in terms of pleasure. Whatever you wanted, Corinth was the place to go. And he plants a church there. Now, the church starts to look a lot like the town. It just gets nasty. The people who are leading the church are celebrating all kinds of nasty sexual sin. Paul specifically says in his letters to Corinth that one of the problems he confronts is that people are coming to church and getting hammered on the communion wine, like drinking all of it to the point that they're drunk, and no one can even take communion because some of the people came early and got hammered on the wine. And these kind of behaviors are things that they're celebrating. It's funny to them. And so if you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the tone is a little strong. Paul's writing an angry letter to Corinth, 2 of them. They weren't fun to read, I'm sure. But smack dab in the middle of 1 Corinthians, do you know what we find? We find 1 Corinthians 13. So we go through things of him being like, hey, you have created a gender war, you're misusing people, you're misusing alcohol, you're misusing sex, you're doing all of these things that you shouldn't be doing. And then we get to 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter of the Bible. Oh, by the way, love is patient, love is kind. Love is not easily angered. We hear this is read at weddings all of the time because it sounds like a Hallmark card. It sounds like a cute and fuzzy chapter in the middle of our Bible. And it is not. You guys, it is a weapon. It's a scalpel. Paul is telling them in that moment, your church, it only has one hope. Your one hope is agape love. To choose something different, to choose a kind of love for each other. And so he's saying agape is patient and kind. Agape isn't jealous or boastful or proud or rude. Agape doesn't demand its own way. Agape is not irritable. It doesn't keep a record of being wronged. Agape behaves differently than the kind of love you think you're practicing toward each other. Agape doesn't give up. Agape doesn't lose faith. Agape is always hopeful. Agape endures through every circumstance. Eros doesn't do that. Phileo doesn't do that because your passions fade and your affections fade, but agape doesn't fade. the engine of love, that kind of love, keeps firing. And when Jesus kneels down in front of Judas and washes his feet, and then hours later goes to his death for you and I, he shows us the full extent of his love in its extremity. That's what agape looks like. Friends, Jesus redefines it for us. Secondly, Jesus redefines leadership. Now, I told you that John doesn't talk about, he does not talk a lot about the dinner. Luke does. Luke actually tells us one of the conversation topics at dinner. Let me read it for you. It'll be on the screen. Then they began to argue among themselves about who would be the greatest among them. This is the dinner conversation with the disciples. And Jesus told them, in this world, the kings and great men lord it over their people, and yet they're called friends of the people. But among you, it will be different. Those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant. Who is more important, the one who sits at the table or the one who serves? The one who sits at the table, of course, but not here, for I am among you as one who serves. Interesting. As this passage in verse 3 makes it clear that Jesus had authority. Y'all, the commander of the angel armies is sitting at the table. All authority in heaven and earth given to him. All authority. In our culture, leaders are not servants. We do not like being served by someone that we see as important. Again, I will say, you may not like that truth, but that's the truth. We treat people by how we see them in the pecking order. And people who have a lot of authority, we think it's inappropriate for them to serve us, which is why Peter felt that way. Let me illustrate. Let's say that you are having a garage sale, right? And so, things are going fine. And then at your garage sale, you see the Brandon Grant family walk up to your garage sale. And you're Eastview goers, and you haven't had a chance to meet him yet. And so you're like, oh, well, that's kind of cool. I can get a chance to meet Brandon. And so you walk up and you say, hey, you're Brandon, and we go to Eastview, but we haven't had a chance to. And right at that moment, your kid comes running out from inside and says, I just clogged the toilet, and there's water everywhere. It's overflowing. Which is, by the way, exactly when things like that happen as parents. And in that moment, Brandon says, cool, I'll go take care of it, and just marches inside your house. How you feeling about that? That inner angst of like, no. That's my filth, okay? I don't want to let you in the house because I view that you have authority, and that is the most demeaning task, and so you should not be doing that. That's, of course, what Peter's feeling in that moment. I don't want my feet washed, especially by someone who I respect greatly. But in this moment, again, Jesus is teaching us something that's different in his kingdom. In our world, when we think of leadership, it's a pyramid. Business works this way. All leadership really works this way. And you have a person or a few people at the top of the pyramid. The CEO sits there. The vice presidents sit underneath the CEO, and then you've got your structures. You've got your management, and you've got your project managers, and you've got the people who are doing the work, and you've got sales, and you've got you've got janitorial staff. It's like you keep going down the pyramid until you get to the bottom of the pyramid. And Jesus is messing with that big time if you aren't picking up on that. He actually completely inverts the pyramid. He's not saying that there's anything wrong with authority. He's just saying, hey, if you want to be at the top, you're actually at the bottom. You want to be great in my kingdom? You want to be that person at the top? Great. But it means that you serve everybody. It means that everybody is above you. It means that you're going to stoop low to make everybody great. He completely flips this idea. And in our culture, we have a lot of people who want to have influence and who want to be leaders. And I think Jesus would say, great, that's absolutely great. There's nothing wrong with you being a leader and having influence. But keep in mind the model. Because if you want that, that means that you are to serve everybody. The greatest among you must be the greatest as servants. You guys, and then Jesus is the one who God is the one who exalts at the proper time. And we see God following his own rules here. You will never outserve Jesus because he has served you in the greatest way that anyone could serve in the history of humanity, which is why he has been exalted to the highest name of anyone in the history of humanity. We serve a God who follows his own rules and who loved us and served us in that way. So you want to be, husbands talking to you in the room, you're like, I want to be the spiritual leader of my family. Great. I just hate to tell you that that doesn't necessarily mean decision maker. It actually means that you need to get below the rest of your family and serve them like that. Wives, you want to be a spiritual leader in your family? Awesome. Get below and serve other people. Kids, you want to show leadership in your school and your family? Great. It means getting low. It means serving people who don't deserve to be served. That's what it means. In this one act, I need you to understand too, it didn't undermine Jesus' authority. It's who he is. Philippians 2, being in the very nature of God, he made himself nothing. He took the nature of a servant and found in that appearance, humbled himself even to death on a cross. I'm summing up Philippians 2 there. Bishop Dale Bronner said it better than I'm saying it, so I'll let him say it. If serving is below you, leadership is beyond you. The church should not be infected with the world's idea of leadership. Again, there's nothing wrong with authority. It's the posture, the heart posture that comes along with it that Jesus wants to transform for those who are in authority. So you want authority? Great. But the greatest among you has got to learn to be a servant. All right, lastly, and I'm going to move through this one fast, Jesus redefines weakness. Because we equate serving with weakness. The weak serve the strong. That's the way that it works in our world, but that's not what we see here. No one here is going to argue that Jesus is weak. No one is going to argue that his posture here is him taking on weakness. And so we begin to understand that real strength actually is restrained strength. Jesus will say it later to Peter when Peter's like, he slices off the high priest's servant's ear. And Jesus is like, hey, Peter, you do understand that I could wipe all of this clean. Like I am restraining myself right now from killing all of you. I have enough angel armies at my command to take care of this. I don't need you. I don't need your sword. I'm gentling myself. And so real strength that we see in Jesus is strength that's restrained. It takes real restraint and strength to agape love your enemy. It takes restraint and agape love to speak well of someone when you could speak poorly, to bless instead of curse, to honor your parents when they're wrong, to stick with your kids when they're entitled, to forgive someone who is not sorry. That's when restraint and strength show themselves to be true. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus took it this far. He said, hey, if you're slapped on one cheek, again, in our world, you get slapped on the cheek, you don't slap back, you hit back, okay? Jesus is like, no. And keep in mind, this is not self-defense. That isn't a self-defense passage. This is about humiliation. Jesus is like, somebody humiliates you by slapping you across the face. Show them your strength in restraint by looking them dead in the eyes and saying, hey, I think you missed a cheek, actually. In Roman culture, the soldiers could force you to carry, at any time, they could force you to carry all of their load for a mile. So you could be on your way to a funeral, and they would say, nope, sorry, you got to carry my stuff for a mile. And then you got to walk a mile back. And they abused that all the time. And they loved that authority that they had over people being like, hey, you drop your stuff, carry my gear, we're going a mile. And there's nothing you could do or say about it. And Jesus said, hey, how about you show your agape love? How about you show the strength and restraint that you have by saying, hey, you know what? I think I could do 2 miles today. I think I got 2 miles of pack carrying. And Jesus says, that's where it comes out of this idea that all people will know that you're my disciples by the way you agape love. Because when you start doing crazy stuff like that is so countercultural in this world, people are like, what's going on with you? Nobody carries a pack 2 miles. When people watch you forgiving people who shouldn't be forgiven, they'll be like, what's going on with you? What in the world is going on with you? What do you have on the inside that I don't have? Listen, you have been commissioned. This morning, I want to tell you, this John 13 passage commissioned the disciples to serve. You have been empowered to serve. 1 Peter 4:10 says you've been given gifts by the Holy Spirit for the purpose of serving others and building up the body. You have gifts. If you are a follower of Jesus and you are practicing the way, I mean, that's what this whole series is about, then you have been empowered. There are gifts that you need to give because the body needs you and you need the body. It's so important. When you came in this morning, you were given one of these. This is just a way. It lists out tons of different ways that you can serve within our church. And for crying out loud, pick a hallway. I mean, you go down this one and we have junior high and we have high school and special needs and sports ministry. And down this hallway, we have babies and we have grade school and we have the family room that sits out there and the cafe and there's parking and there's the tech people and there's musicians that sit behind. Like all of this stuff that happens to help people create experiences where they know and love Jesus and can come and see him and experience this. We got parents, you guys, who are dealing with 6, 8, 20 kids who are like ages 0 to 8, and they're just doing everything they can to walk through this door. And your ability to minister to them, being like, you know what? I will love on and pray with and worship with your child for an hour while you go have that experience is such an amazing gift to them. An amazing gift to them. When Joe and I first started coming to Eastview, I wasn't in love with the idea of, the word megachurch, not a big selling point for me. And it felt really big and it felt really impersonal and I wasn't sure I liked it until we started serving. I started playing bass in the junior high. That was my entry level here and had a blast. People I got to meet ministered to me, started creating connections. I know we talk a lot about small groups. Small groups are great. Another pathway for you to make this church small for you in a good way is serving. My wife, she serves in the family room, and I'm not exaggerating when I say every time she does it, she comes home and she's like, I love my family group people. Like she loves what she gets to do, but even more so, she loves who she gets to do it with. It has made this church smaller for her, given her community to lean into. And so I will tell you, like, there are lots of places the church needs you. I just don't think that's not the biggest reason to serve. I don't want to guilt you into serving because the church needs you. I think you need it. I think you and I need the humbling that comes with serving other people and choosing to invest in other people. I triple dog dare you to serve. And I know that's a slight breach of etiquette, jumping past the triple dare you to straight to the triple dog dare you, but so be it. That's what I'm doing this morning. 4 of you got that reference. That's okay. But you're not just commissioned and you're not just empowered. You are commanded, not by me. That wouldn't mean much. By Jesus. He says, a new commandment I give you. This is just after he does this, John 13, 34, and 35. A new commandment I give you to agape love one another. As I have agape loved you, again, this is just following the foot washing. As I have agape loved you, so you go agape love one another. I can't get out of it. Jesus has told me that this is the way that his followers behave. We don't follow the rules of this world. We follow the rules of his world. And in his kingdom, leaders serve. His people who follow the way of Jesus, we serve. Francis Chan, there was a sermon illustration he used years ago that I can't not share with you this morning. He was talking about his daughter, Rachel, and he said, if I go to my daughter, Rachel, and I say, hey, Rachel, go clean your room. And she says, okay, I'll go clean my room. And he says, and if I come back 2 or 3 hours later and her room is not clean, and I say, hey, Rachel, why isn't your room clean? And she says, well, I was just spent this time memorizing what you said, Dad. I memorized every word you said about cleaning your room. I think it's fantastic. I agree with the principle of cleaning your room. I think it's a great principle. And then so he's like, okay, well, go clean your room. And he says, if in 2 or 3 hours later, she comes back and says, hey, I know I haven't cleaned my room yet, but I did learn how to say clean your room in Greek. Dad, are you proud of me? It's like in 2 or 3 hours later, I'm like, Rachel, your room still isn't clean. And she says, well, I know, but I brought some friends over and we've been writing songs about cleaning our room and they are great. And it has been a very emotional experience, singing about cleaning our room. We're all very excited about it. He's like, at what point do we clean our room? At what point do we go out and do the thing? And I feel that with this text this morning, that I mean, you guys, I can wax eloquently for a long time on the principles of service, of what it means to humble ourselves and to think differently about what this is. But just like driver's ed, there's a point where we got to leave the classroom and experientially live this out. And sure, serving in the church is one way to do this, but there are a million applications that belong to you and how this makes its way into your family and how this makes its way into your workplace and how this makes its way into you and who you are, on how you put yourself below others and make them great. It does us no good to understand it, to merely listen to the word and not do what it says. And so this morning, I feel like it would be appropriate for me to give Jesus the last word, because I think he says that in verse 17, when he sums up that lesson and says, hey, now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Eastview, you are a serving church, but we have room to grow. And now you know these things, so you'll be blessed if you do them. Let's stand and respond together.